Hi, everyone. Welcome back to 10 Kids, 2 Docs. I'm Dr. Vivian Carlin.
And I'm Dr. Sylvia Bank. Today, we are going to focus specifically on screen use and traveling with children and screens.
Awesome. Let's jump in.
Welcome to the 10 Kids, 2 Docs podcast. Seasoned pediatricians and longtime friends Sylvia Bank and Vivian Carlin have counseled thousands of parents and are raising 4 and 6 kids, respectively. Join these doctor moms as they incorporate fun and their combined wisdom and experience to share parenting insights for all moms looking for practical and trustworthy guidance. Please note that this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment from your doctor.
The topic and this idea came up based on a segment on the Today Show where they were highlighting just this very topic. And I'm just going to play the clip from the Today Show previewing our topic today.
Says to that woman, "Excuse me, could you please ask your child not to play with the iPad because my child is not allowed to have an iPad on a plane. So could you not make my child
feel bad?
Want that?"
The mother said, "No, I will not. My child, this is traveling. We're just surviving. My child is allowed to use the iPad."
So I think this was what kind of sparked our idea of doing an episode on this based on this discussion on the Today Show, having iPad on the airplane like these people or traveling and screen use during travel. So why don't we start off by talking about our own personal experiences as moms with this topic? And why don't you begin, Vivian, by telling me your experiences?
Okay, yes. I have lots and lots of stories about screens and travel. As you know, Sylvia, we did a ton of road tripping with our kids. When I had fewer kids, when I was younger and probably had more energy, I feel like I look back on myself and I think I was very creative with our time in the car. They were listening to audiobooks or doing creative things in the car or interacting with each other and talking to me. And it was all really glorious and beautiful. Okay. And so then fast forward a few years and I now have 6 children. And this is, I feel like, a very big turning point in my parenting and screens and travel. So, as I mentioned before, my youngest 2 are adopted. When we got my daughter, she was almost 2. And from the beginning, she would cry in the car. I don't know what it was. If it was some motion sickness, I didn't see signs of that. If it was the being strapped in, I don't know what it was, but it was so irritating to her that we just knew she was going to cry. Eventually that resolved. A year or so after that, Eric and I decided to take some of our children to Virginia to visit his brother and his family.
Right.
So it's Eric and I and my 8-year-old son and my now 2-year-old and 1-year-old. And we go and we visit them over Easter. And then Eric stays to work and I'm flying back alone with my 3 children. And we got on that flight and I put my 2-year-old, who is this daughter who initially I remember had trouble riding in the car. I put her in her car seat and she starts crying and I'm trying to console her while holding my 1-year-old. I'm like, okay, let's just get past takeoff. And she's escalating and crying. And to make a long story short, she literally screamed the entire 2.5-hour flight.
You were that passenger.
I am. I'm that mom. She never stopped. I mean, and it was like temper tantrum scream. You can recognize the difference. It wasn't like a "I'm in pain, pitiful, please help me" cry. It was like, I am angry and I am screaming at you. It was
your lungs. Yeah.
It was the entire time. So, and my 8-year-old son was so patient, and I didn't have any. I mean, we didn't have tablets for our kids because we had never done that. We had never needed to travel with it. I wasn't in any way prepared for this. And I remember that plane landed and I literally in my mind calculated, if I just leave our checked bags and come back to the airport and pick them up, can I just get to the car and never have to face these other passengers again?
I'm sure every passenger on that plane was very irritated with your daughter's crying and probably also had a lot of sympathy for you, right?
Well, I mean, I think there were probably some that had sympathy for me, but there were probably some that were like, this
Lady.
mom cannot control her children.
Lady, stop your child from crying.
Seriously. I mean, and I Like, I mean, literally, it was the entire time, and I was so embarrassed to go to baggage claim because it was pretty obvious who it was. So I did collect the baggage. I
Right.
faced my fears.
It sounds like a pivotal moment in parenting.
Yes,
It
yes.
sounds like an unbearable moment, as a mom and a pediatrician, just thinking and putting myself in your shoes for those 2.5 hours.
Yes.
Ugh, that's one you're not gonna forget, right?
Okay, tell me about your travel and screen, Sylvia.
Sure. So I similarly to you in the beginning, really tried to plan out the screen time, to try to keep it at a minimum. We actually even had that old school DVD
Mm,
player where, we kind of like decided what we were going to watch, put it on, but not watch the entire time, because it was very
right.
allocated thing. And then I also had like a series of old devices. So there were I have 4 kids, they each have their own, handheld device, one of the hand-me-downs, playing their one individual game, and then it was a timer cycling. So every 15 minutes, they would have to stop their game, trade devices, you know,
Oh,
and then they would give it up, and then they would pass it on and get another one and then play. And in my mind as a parent who's trying to limit screens, they're not getting obsessed with one thing.
right, right.
They have to end.
Yes,
A finite point where you need to stop
yes,
right now, which
yes.
is very hard for anyone nowadays with screens. So in
Yeah.
my mind, it's like we're holding off and holding off, watch the movie, hold off, an hour of,
Mhm.
mobile, that type of thing. So very similar to you initially. And I think my story is actually similar to yours of when that went out the window.
Okay,
So
yes, do tell.
there was a period of time, and I think my family definitely, for me as a mom and having a lot of children and approaching holiday time, unstructured time, it is almost like this impending doom of, no structure for the kids. What are we going to do? My big way of dealing with that as a parent of multiple children was to organize trips, like
Mm,
something to look forward to, getting together with other families where, my husband and I are friends with the parents. Our kids have playmates and someone to interact with. So everything is always very scheduled and very regimented. The screen time is regimented. But there was an unexpected trip that came up for our family. And during that time, without a lot of pre prep, everything went out the window. Traveling was going to be stressful. It was a last minute trip. And at that point, we watched movies that entire trip. So, I think the best plan to keep screens at a minimum is great, but knowing and understanding that situations come up where you just have to do what you have to do to reduce stress and get the trip done.
yes, and I remember that trip, Sylvia, and I just want to point out when you say that you did it on very little time, you actually drove 24 hours basically straight, right? Like, you did not stop. You just
Yeah,
went straight through from Maryland to Colorado.
it was a straight trip where my husband and I traded off sleeping while the other one was driving, and all tricks were pulled to get that trip done. We literally just watched screens the entire trip. That moment where it's like, okay, we need to make this happen, and our previous plans are out the window. And honestly, we got there.
You're like, "Hey, I could get used to this."
No, I think that is that one of my most memorable screen travel
Mhm.
experiences.
Well
You have so many trips, Vivian. I'm sure you have another
well
experience with
well,
screens.
I will say that I think after that one plane trip, we did do another road trip because we would road trip every summer somewhere generally, and I pre-planned that one, and I think gosh, I mean, I think at that point I had bought multiple DVD players, which we still have actually. I love those things.
You still use it?
Yes, I still hack them for road trips because it's like a very forced intentionality of this is what I'm going to do, and it's not quite as stimulating as a handheld gaming device that is what everybody most wants. At
Right.
any rate, all that to say, I remember for that particular child Everybody knew she had her headphones, she had her own device, and we positioned her in our passenger van all the way in the back corner, and she traveled that whole way like a champ. And I felt like a rock star. I was
Mhm.
like, I have solved our travel problem. She gets the corner, she gets an extra seat next to her that's like her own space to put her stuffed animals or whatever. And she gets a device that she knows how to operate. I mean, she was, gosh, at this point, 3, and she did great. And I'm
Mhm.
like, "Oh my gosh, it was that simple.
Right,
Done. So
right.
worth it."
Every single person on that flight from Virginia to Texas would have appreciated that setup, right?
Right, 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 right. And I mean, we're now, a decade later, and she is a great traveler.
Right.
Road trips, she has flown a couple times, and she does fabulous.
Mhm.
Manages her own things. She does not have to be on screens the whole time. In fact, I have a photo from 6 months ago where we were on Southwest, and she and my one of my sons were in the row in front of me, and I looked over to check on them, and they were playing chess with an actual chessboard. And I took a photo so that I would remember how far we've come, because I was so touched, not only that they were choosing to play chess and one of them packed the chessboard and they're doing this together, but just thinking about her. This is what she was choosing to do. She did not need to be on a screen at that point. So it was just what we needed to do to get through that season of life.
Yeah. And I also want to highlight, and I think I briefly touched on this, but I want to be more explicit about it. Travel in general is stressful for any family and parents.
Absolutely.
And the reason why we travel is multifactorial. One, you know, family get togethers, having grandparents or aunts
Mhm.
and uncles see cousins see each other, that pull of wanting family to be together. Sometimes parents also have they traveled a lot as, before they had children or when they were single, and traveling is a major part of their recreation and enjoyment,
Right.
and so there's a lot of benefits of traveling, but as we describe traveling as parents or traveling with
Mhm.
children, it can be one of the most stressful times for parents to achieve that family get together or that enjoyment that they're looking for in
A
travel.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think we should transition to just general guidance on screens and travel.
So I think one of your main points, which I want to reiterate here, and playing the clip on the Today Show,
Mhm.
is that it is an individual thing, right?
Yes.
Could those same people on the airplane with your daughter crying and screaming, if that scenario had gone differently and she had her individual device and her earphones and she was sitting in the corner on her device, could there have been another scenario where a passenger saw that and negatively judged you for that? You know,
Right.
I think it puts parents in this very interesting position of constantly being judged.
Yes, yes, yes.
Like,
Yeah, so Sylvia, I'm probably going to say this every time we talk about screens, but in my own mind and my own parenting, when I think about screens, I think screens are useful to parents for survival. And I like alliteration. I break survival down into 3 subcategories that all start with S. Screens are useful when parents need to sleep. Screens are useful for safety, as in I need to make a phone call or I need to talk to somebody who's coming to the house and I'm going to be distracted, and I can put my child in front of a screen and know that they're going to be safe. And screens are useful for sanity. So, had I had a screen on the plane when I was ill prepared with my daughter, it would have been beneficial for my sanity and the sanity of all of those people around me. And they even reference that the mom says, "Hey, we're just trying to survive," right? So I
right.
feel like I recognize with that when I had this child who did not travel well, that we needed to use screens so that we could survive our trip, be it road
Right.
trip or flying,
Right.
just like this parent recognized.
I love that. I love the survival.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I don't know, that was definitely not a factor with a lot of my children. I mean, I had children who probably could have done a 20-hour road trip without ever watching a screen.
Right.
And they may have complained. They would have just maybe pouted and been disappointed, but they had the self-control and the ability to just sit there if that was what was required.
Right. Yeah, and I also feel like I like your 3 S's because I feel like a lot of the American Academy of Pediatric recommendations for screens for the younger age group recommend interactive screen use. So
Mm.
you're watching with your child
Yes,
or you're
yes, yes.
playing the game with your child.
Yeah.
And I feel like those recommendations are different when it comes to traveling and surviving through the travel experience.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. So I've been toying around with this analogy in my mind, but I kind of think of when you're traveling, okay, you've got to think about this individual child, and then
Mhm.
you've got to think about your own personal stress with traveling. And so I kind of imagine in my mind you're like working with different fractions and you're trying to find the least common denominator, right? So you've got your child's fraction of how well or not well do they travel. You've got your own fraction of like how well or not well do you travel, and then you're going to use the screen to find the multiple to get to the least common denominator, right?
Right.
So
I mean,
I I travel pretty well. This is largely based on my husband because he's so low stress, but I don't get stressed out in the airport. I don't get stressed out on road trips. I don't get too stressed out with children screaming. I'm a pretty low key traveler, and some of my children are low key travelers. So we don't have to multiply anything. We're okay. We don't need to use screens. But on the continuum of screen use, when I start to have children where I'm like, we need to use a screen to travel, you reference this. I think about screens on a continuum of, again, what's that least common multiplier? So, and in my
mhm,
mind, it's like, what is the least stimulating choice we can make, all the way to the most stimulating choice? Maybe the most distracting is a better way to put it. So,
right,
like, least stimulating, like, can they have a shared experience? Can we pre-pick a
right,
movie that they have to be attentive to for that whole time? Can we have a headphone splitter? Can the movie be something like Disney Nature instead of
right,
something with like super fast scene changes every 3 seconds, right? Let's go as low stimulating as possible. Or can they have a device where they just have a playlist? Right?
right,
So they're just listening to audio. I mean, could
right,
that playlist be an audiobook, right? I have had some kids that do really well with just listening to an audiobook. And again, I'm minimizing that like, stimulation to their brain all the way up to that child who I just know it's going to be stressful. They're going to travel best if they have a handheld device that they're choosing different interactive games to do. But
mhm,
then if they're doing that, can it be logic games? Can it be playing chess online? Can we again make that as
mhm.
educational and as least like, stimulating as possible, all the way up to what they really want, which is, all of the fun interactive
The
games.
unlimited,
Unlimited, individual, not a shared experience,
individual,
or
unlimited. Yeah.
yes, games.
Yeah, I think we're definitely addressing the reality of parenting and screens that I think when I read a lot of the recommendations from guidelines, it is very much dancing around this reality of basically using screens to occupy your children when you're not doing it. Like
Mhm.
this is the purpose in this setting of the screen, and I think you and I are both saying it's not something that we do on the daily, but there is a time and place for the use of screens on occasion for parents.
Yes, yes, yes. Well,
So,
and I think we get so accustomed to it that it can feel like this is what you're supposed to do, and
mhm,
you and I have both said there are kids that don't need that, and there's incredible benefit on the road trip, for example, of just sitting and looking out the window. They can sit there and be fascinated by watching the world around them, and I want their brain to take that in if that works.
and there's also a certain degree of, children that get that benefit of just watching the world go by. It's not like those children aren't complaining a little bit too. There's
Right,
this
right.
balance of how much do you let your child complain versus how much complaining can you tolerate as a parent? And then when the screen comes into play. Another thing I think you were talking about that I want to stress is the mindfulness that you and I both have in anticipating screen use.
Mm,
And this is kind of a common theme I think that will probably hit on quite a bit about in order to not be overwhelmed as parents, we wind up doing a lot of pre-preparation, right?
Mhm.
Anticipating this spectrum of your least common,
Right.
denominator, right? Like to say, well, I have one thing with the preloaded audiobook and the
Yes.
music.
Yes, yes,
You know,
yes.
but, I also have the next thing, which is the nature programming documentary video. And then the next level I have prepared of and it goes on to the more engaging and more stimulating spectrum. But that is a pre preparation that both you and I have
Yes.
done on the parenting end to be mindful of when we use what type of screen in
Mhm.
what scenario, and to be prepared with that instead of in the moment where your child is throwing a fit, you're like getting out your phone, you have
Yeah.
no children apps, and you're pulling up YouTube. So I feel like a piece of advice that can be used here is that preparation portion to kind of give a little bit of allowance to say, no, but we also have our emergency app and our emergency, set of things that we can opt to if need be, right?
Okay, in summary, Sylvia, as I think about what we've said, I think of three concluding points. First of all, every child is going to be different in this respect and have different needs. So there are going to be some children that will travel fabulously with no screens. And in that case, parents should feel the freedom and be encouraged to not use screens. There's going to be other children that are going to travel miserably and make everybody around them miserable without screens. And in that case, parents should feel the freedom to use screens as much as you need and feel like you're doing really well that you've enabled your family to travel again. The second point I would say is intentionality. You discussed this as pre-planning.
Mhm.
I use that term like least common multiple. What is the least stimulating, least isolating thing we can do with a screen to make travel still manageable? So if I can get my children to agree on a movie and watch it together with a headphone splitter, then that's success. Let me pre-think what's going to work to give them some screen option that will make travel manageable as well. And then I think the third point is that in all of this, there needs to be fluidity. So we're going to make rules that we think work. And a year later, that might all change. And we have to reassess and reestablish for our family what's going to work.
Right. And I think also the removement of judgment of other parents and how they utilize screens at this moment, because traveling is a very public thing. You see how other parents interact and families, what they do and what they watch and what they utilize, and to be mindful that everyone is making the best decisions for their own families.
Yeah, a
Yeah,
good point.
good topic. So this is 10 Kids, 2 Docs. I'm Sylvia.
And I'm Vivian. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to 10 Kids 2 Docs, hosted and created by Sylvia Bank and Vivian Carlin. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and recommend our podcast to other listeners. Visit our website at 10kids2docs.com, where you can find links to social media and leave comments or suggestions. Back next week with more topics in parenting.